I can't think without Freud. He's just a great teacher in terms of understanding the world, understanding history, understanding politics, giving you kind of concepts to understand the unconscious, giving you a place that it is in individual development, and situating it in terms of a kind of anthropological or evolutionary psychological theory. That's a very powerful trifecta, so to speak.
This is the Thinking Mind podcast.
Welcome back to the Thinking Mind podcast. Today it's Alex, and I'm very happy to bring you a conversation with Eli Zaretsky. Eli Zaretsky is a professor of history at the New School for Social Research in New York, and he's taught there since 1999. His interests include 20th century cultural history, the theory and history of capitalism, including the social and cultural dimensions, and the history of the family. He's published a number of books, including Political Freud and Secrets of the Soul, a social and cultural history of psychoanalysis. He's also written the book Why America Needs a Left. We had a very interesting conversation all about Freud, psychoanalysis, really from a historical perspective, and how psychoanalytic ideas can help us understand certain events in history. And today we really focused on events in the 20th century, such as the rise of Nazism and World War II and the Holocaust, as well as broader concepts like prejudice and racism. It was an amazing conversation to have with Professor Zaretsky, and I'm very happy to bring it to you today. As always, to new listeners, welcome. Here at the Thinking Mind podcast, you can access conversations all about psychiatry, psychology, therapy, self-development, and related topics. To OG listeners, welcome back. And now here's today's episode with Professor Eli Zaretsky. Professor Zaretsky, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
I've seen some of your work online, some of your lectures on YouTube, and what I found really interesting about it, I think really interesting work exists at the intersections of different kinds of different subjects, different topics, and your work seems to exist at the intersection of history, psychology, sociology, which I find very compelling. So I'd like to talk to you about a few things, Freud, psychoanalysis, and maybe how we can use psychoanalysis to better understand things that have happened in the past and maybe things that are happening now. But to start with, I'm very curious, how did you come to start studying Freud, and how did he become one of your academic focuses?
Freud, I was born in 1940, and growing up in that time, the 50s and the 60s, Freud was still very much in the air. He was one of the great figures at that time. You kind of entered into a world of Freud, Kafka, Dostoevsky. These were the great figures of my childhood. I think as an adolescent, I think the interest in sexuality was very important to me. And then in the 60s, I was a new leftist, and I wrote my first book was a response to the rise of the women's movement in the early 70s. And I felt that I had really exhausted with that book what Marxism had to say, which was a lot, about the things that interested me at that point, which were basically the history of the family, gender, sexuality, and so forth. And actually, the thing that got me interested in Freud was I was editing a Marxist journal at that point, and I went to review Juliet Mitchell's Feminism and Psychoanalysis, and when I read her book, I felt I didn't know anything about Freud. I had never read Freud until then, but I felt that to review her book properly, I had to read Freud, and I started reading Freud, and I found him very, very absorbing, and that led me into that world.
Mm-hmm. And what was compelling about it? What did you find absorbing?
It was just the focus on just basically psychology, just the whole world of understanding things from the point of view of what goes on inside individuals. For example, I remember I was reading Freud in the medical library at a hospital near me. They had the complete set. I remember when I read his piece on Leonardo da Vinci, and I was still thinking as a leftist, and I thought, gee, this is really ridiculous. He doesn't just talk about the nature of the Renaissance and the cities and the rise of capitalism and all of these things, the ways in which I would have, previously thought about, and I still would, think about Leonardo da Vinci. But then I just realized that he had just opened like a shaft of light on, something else, namely his Da Vinci's interiority and so forth, and it just became very, very powerful. And also Freud, the way he he engages the reader in a very personal way. I was just talking to a friend about the difference between critique, which comes from a point of view of authority, and commentary, which is enmeshed in the material. And Freud is very, very much enmeshed in the material. Mm-hmm. He just gives you this, and he really is a teacher. He really explains to the listener what he's doing, how he's thinking, why we think a certain way.
Yes. What do you think psychoanalysis... So Freud obviously is known as the founder of psychoanalysis. What does psychoanalysis teach us that was revolutionary at the time? What's different about psychoanalysis as a way of understanding human psychology?
Well, you have the idea of the unconscious before Freud in various sort of impressionistic ways, in literary ways, romanticism, the image of the sea. And so there's an awareness in the 19th century and even earlier that what we call the conscious mind is only the surface of what goes on inside people. But first of all, with Freud, you really get a very full, comprehensive way of understanding what the unconscious is. You get a theory of how it arises within the individual in terms of individual development, the importance of infancy, the relationship to the parents. And you also have it situated in a, kind of a very profound, if not fully developed, theory of human history, in the sense of the role that gender and sexuality in the form of the Oedipus complex and the evolution of the family plays in, creation of states and societies and civilizations. And that's, those three things actually, giving you kind of concepts to understand the unconscious, giving you a place that it is in individual development, and situating it in terms of a kind of anthropological or evolutionary psychological theory. That's a very powerful trifecta, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And also neatly showing how all of these forces at play within human psychology lead to a lot of mental suffering.
That's true. Undoubtedly, undoubtedly, I was also attracted to Freud because of my own suffering and because of the suffering around me, which was, really very intense in the 1970s when I first got interested in Freud. Had a lot to do with the collapse of the New Left and the collapse of the kind of the utopian hopes of that period. You had the rise of the women's movement, which was very positive, but you had the demise of the hopes of a mixed left and so forth. Hopes I've never actually given up.
Yeah. What would be a mixed left?
A mixed left, men and women in the same movement.
I see.
Is what I mean by a mixed left.
So it's quite partitioned by gender.
Yeah, since the 70s, we certainly have been. So there were personal, there were personal things about it, but I don't think that was uppermost. And I would not really recommend Freud as the most helpful thing to deal with problems. There are a lot of ways of dealing with problems without Freud, but he's just a great teacher in terms of understanding the world, understanding history, understanding politics. I just don't. I can't think without Freud.
Yeah. So it's almost the therapeutic application, because in my world, the therapeutic applications are primary.
Right. Well, what happened with psychoanalysis was that in Freud's lifetime, the therapeutic applications, in the sense of the treatment, the treatment of mental illness or the treatment of neurotic suffering or whatever, was secondary.
Yeah.
And Freud thought it was secondary and so forth, and he was even somewhat dubious about how much you could help people and that kind of thing. He thought what was really primary was the conception of the mind. And when you look back in that period in the history of psychoanalysis, the people who came into psychoanalysis, incidentally, many of them women, were interested. They came from literature, they came from history, art history, sciences. They came from a broad interdisciplinary, and they were not all focused on treatment. And what's happened with the evolution of psychoanalysis today is completely focused on treatment. They have no sense of the broader culture that psychoanalysis once represented. And my own personal contribution, in my view, to psychoanalysis is trying to bring that back.
Yes, to try and bring back the greater context in which it was embedded.
Yes.
That's interesting. There are lots of different types of therapy now, of course. And I think one of the things they take away from psychoanalysis is the utility of expressing yourself spontaneously as a way of coming to understand things that you're not consciously aware of. But as you're saying, I mean, the therapy world is totally different now in terms of, like, classical psychoanalysis is very rarely practiced in that pure form. But it sounds like, from what you're saying, it was more thought of as almost a means of philosophical investigation rather than a treatment.
Yeah, I mean, that would be. I wouldn't put it quite as strongly as you just put it, but I wouldn't say either or.
Yeah.
But more important was the consequences for the human sciences, for philosophy, literature, and so forth of having a sort of richer, fuller understanding of the human mind, and incidentally of groups, not just individuals, but how groups function, which is a very, very important part in the history of psychoanalysis, and has made contributions to understanding things like war and politics and so forth, racism.
Yeah. So moving on to that.
Yes.
Thinking about the 20th century, which was very remarkable in that so many cataclysmic things happened.
Yes.
World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, the invention of atomic weapons, the Cold War, Vietnam War, you name it. How can psychoanalytic thought help us to understand that century? I mean, you mentioned Dostoevsky, who had something to say. Nietzsche had something to say prophetically about the 20th century.
Very much so.
How do these thinkers, and Freud in particular, help us to understand what happened?
If you think about the 20th century historically, which is, think what was going on in the previous centuries. You have the Enlightenment, you have the rise of liberalism, you have the rise of capitalism, of representative government, you have free governments, the extension of the suffrage, and so forth. You have really a very basic sense growing of the importance of individual freedom. But what you don't have, which you have in the 20th century, is the rise of masses of people. What really characterizes the 20th century and is intimately connected with the cataclysms of the 20th century. The 20th century was disastrous, at least certainly the first half. I mean, the unparalleled suffering and stupidity and violence of World War I, of Bolshevism, of Nazism, fascism, at least until you come down to the second half, which is certainly better. What caused these catastrophes? At least a half a century or so of true catastrophes. There's no simple answer. I'm not trying to give an answer to, and in general, history, you don't have single causes in history. It's not like physics where you really can analyze things down to a basic level. History is not like that, but what you have in history, you have to weave together different factors. And one of the most important things to understand about the kind of catastrophe of World War I and World War II, the Holocaust, the concentration camps, the Gulag, and so forth, is the rise of mass phenomena, masses of people. These are the people this is what fascism mobilized, and these were the people that were sort of left out of the liberal story in the 19th century and, the 18th century. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche especially, Nietzsche was very aware of this. And psychoanalysis has a huge amount to offer in terms of understanding that phenomenon, because it is, it has a theory. First of all, it foregrounds the importance of irrationality. It foregrounds the way in which people are driven by forces that they're not really conscious of. The whole model which you have in the 18th century and the 19th century of the rational individual is just not adequate. It's just not right. And then it foregrounds the importance of identification, of mimesis, which is not a psychoanalytic word, but it's it describes what is going on, what draws people to one another and leads them to form groups and masses and so forth, and in what way you can introduce rationality into that process and democracy, and in what way that's difficult.
Yes. So you have technology which allows for a mass psychology, so things like radio and broadcasting. But also, and I guess Nietzsche talked about this a lot, I'm curious if Freud can talk about it. Maybe you can tell me. There seems to be in the 20th century a decline of the larger meaning-making institutions, by which I mean usually the larger religious institutions seem to be declining, which prior to the 20th century are giving people an overarching sense of what their life means and where it's going. And do you think that decline left a vacuum for ideologies like fascism or communism to take hold?
Well, I think, first of all, I think if we think globally, I don't think that religion is declining.
Okay.
It's all the more important as we get. There are 8 billion people in the world, or more, and when you go to Asia, when you spend time in India, and in East Asia and so forth, you just realize how massive the human population is, and a lot of, certainly India, and Latin America, so forth, religion is a driving force in politics and so on. And the United States is one of the most religious countries in the world. In Europe, religion is declining. Fascism was basically a response to communism. It was a response to the threat, what was perceived to be the threat of socialism. And one of the things that really drove a lot of people crazy about Marxism was that it was atheistic. Mm-hmm. The Catholic Church, certainly, Italian fascism and even Nazism got a lot of support from the Catholic Church. Franco in Spain. So religion was important. It was in terms of understanding fascism and communism. It was not as important as it is today.
So taking a specific case like the Nazis, fascism. Yeah. How does psychoanalysis, how could it be applied to help us understand that phenomenon?
Well, I'll give you part of an answer. Anti-Semitism, which is pretty fundamental to fascism and obviously to Nazism. When you go back to the late 19th century, the origins of modern anti-Semitism, not the Catholic Church's anti-Semitism or religious anti-Semitism, that says that the Jews killed Christ. That because the Church actually had the idea of preserving the Jews as an example of error, and that eventually, the Jews would convert, and that would herald the second coming and so forth. I think that's still part of evangelical religion. But when you come to modern anti-Semitism, which arises with capitalism really at the end of the 19th century, why did it become so important? There's a French fascist by the name of Charles Maurras. He's the founder of Action Française, which was the French fascist movement. And he says, until we discovered anti-Semitism, we were lost. We wanted to develop a right-wing, nationalist, pro-religious, pro-monarchy movement in France, but until we discovered anti-Semitism, which is in the 1890s in the Dreyfus Affair, we were lost. And the reason is we were trying to do it on the basis of an external enemy. We were trying to develop the French people against the Germans and against the English. Anti-Semitism gave us an internal enemy, something cleansing the nation from within. The dirty part of... You cannot understand that mentality of cleansing a group of people from within without beginning to understand things from a psychoanalytic point of view, what it means to have a fantasy of something dirty and destructive inside your group, your family. We French have something dirty inside. We all share this feeling of having something dirty inside of us. You can't begin to understand that without talking about mothers and infants and so forth. So that's an example.
And it applies to individuals, each individual feeling like they have something, some inherent wrongness.
And they make a group out of it. They also feel that they share it with other people. It makes a project.
And so a lot of prejudice, because prejudice, I suppose, underlies a lot of this. So, for example, in fascism, let's say in Nazism, the prejudice would be against Jews or non-Aryans. In communism, the prejudice would be against people who were economically successful, who are felt to be economically privileged, perhaps. And in all these different forms of prejudice, it's something about projecting badness into another, projecting badness such that it gives you leverage to then take some sort of nationalistic action.
Yes, I basically agree with that, although I don't really know how to analyze. As you could see, I've thought about the question of anti-Semitism. I don't really see communism and fascism as basically the same thing.
Yeah. I should probably make it clear that I don't see them as the same thing exactly.
Right. So, but if you ask me what is the difference, I'm not sure that I have a very good answer. There's an Israeli historian who writes a lot about communism from a psychoanalytic point of view. I think his name is Yigal Halfin. And I have a bunch of his books, but I haven't read them yet, so I don't really know. I'm looking forward. He analyzes autobiographies, communist autobiographies.
There's some interesting work that's been done on using personality traits to predict political orientation. And the work seems to suggest that traits such as agreeableness, so being high in compassion, for instance, and empathy, and being high in a trait called openness to experience, predispose you to having a politically left orientation. And so one line of thought is that being oriented to the political left is being oriented towards wanting equality fundamentally, and might be driven by an underlying compassion. And that works very well for small groups of people. But when groups become very big, so when you think about a country like the Soviet Union, it becomes very difficult to moderate that equality. So inevitably, you end up the amount of enforcement and tyranny you require to attempt to enforce that equality becomes unmanageable, and you end up having an unequal distribution of power anyway because of the centralization of power, something like that. So there's something about a personality that's motivated initially by compassion and by an openness to new ideas, but then gets distorted at some point.
I definitely believe that the left is the predisposition toward the left. There is a psychological predisposition. The way I see it is in terms of Melanie Klein's theory of the depressive position. Klein says, you start life in a sort of paranoid position where you feel things are happening to you, but that you kind of achieve what she calls a depressive position, which is that you feel that you may have hurt your mother, and that you want to repair. So what she calls reparation. And I do believe that a lot of the history of the left at its best, of course, the left also has all the craziness and so forth, but I do think there are real differences between the kind of paranoia and so forth that you see in a group, like the Trump movement, and more the desire to repair, make things whole, get things back, like climate change and, basically socialist ideas, aspects of feminism, ecology, and so forth. I do think that there is that association. There's a very interesting, I don't know if you know the psychoanalyst Michael Balint.
Yeah.
He's great. And he makes a distinction that I think is very important politically between people who cling to one another, people who need objects excessively, so to speak, and people who need distance, who distance.
Avoidant attachment versus anxious.
Yeah, they avoid objects. They believe in wide open spaces. And I think that is very helpful in terms of understanding liberalism.
Yeah.
What you have now, you with the Trump movement, you have people who are insisting on clinging. They'll all like one another. Part of Trump's genius was creating these rallies where people could see one another and see that they all, were the same kind of people. They were all white, that kind of thing.
They're looking for a sense of national unity.
But basically, we're a country of wide open spaces, the far west and Texas.
America is a country founded by people who thought it would be a good idea to go across the ocean.
Yeah.
At a time when that was a risky endeavor.
It was amazing. I mean, it's a absolutely self-selected country of people who could break with their ties, with their neighborhood, with their culture.
Yeah. Do you feel that the right and the left at the moment are both becoming distorted in ways that are unhelpful? You mentioned the Trump movement, which is an obvious way that the conservative element of American politics is getting distorted. And it seems like there's something about, I think that the right and the left function best when they're in dialogue with each other, because they both have something important to say about how to solve problems. Like, life throws you unpredictable problems. And sometimes the answer might be a conservative answer, i.e., let's do something that we know works, a traditional answer. And sometimes you might need a new answer, an innovative answer, in which case the left might be able to provide a solution. And so it's helpful when the two are in dialogue. But what seems to be happening now is they're becoming more and more polarized and separated. And what you're seeing is two warped, caricatured versions of what they should be. Do you think that's a fair description of what's happening nowadays?
Yeah, I think it is a good description. It's interesting. I haven't thought along those lines exactly, but I think they're good. You said before that it's important for left and right to speak to one another. I'm not sure I would exactly put it that way. I think conservatives have a great deal to offer, and that the left should listen to conservatives just because the basic conservative idea, namely that, well, just the whole human project that certain things really are important to preserve and value, is really what conservatism, not rightism, not the radical right, but conservatism is about. It has a lot to offer, but the most important relationship, in my view, is the relationship between the left and the liberals. So, for example, we were talking before about fascism. It was the liberals in Germany and in Italy and elsewhere that put the fascists in power. And they did it because they didn't want to have leftists in the government. That's what happened in Germany in the early 1930s. That's what happened in Italy in the early 1920s. They turned to Mussolini, they turned to Hitler, because their alternative was to have a relationship with the left. What made the New Deal so great and really globally important in the 1930s in the United States was that there were leftists in government. It was not a leftist government, but it was a liberal government. It had conservatives, it had businessmen, it had bankers. Liberalism by itself is not enough, and leftism by itself is not enough. You need a liberal-left relationship. On the right, I think it's very important to distinguish conservatism and sort of the radical right.
Yeah, let's tease those apart.
Yeah, I would tease those apart, and I would say conservatism is very important, very constructive. The radical right needs to be socialized, sort of, and a lot of the anger and so forth is understandable and justified.
What's the cause of the anger on the right?
The most obvious cause is that the country is run by elite liberals, motivated by money and status, educationally elite, and so forth. And a lot of people have been left out. And what's most important is the Democratic Party, the New Deal, which I think was fantastic, spoke for those people.
Yeah.
And then the Democratic Party changed to, just basically economic growth, not meaning economic growth for an entire population. That's not what happened. We know what happens when you let markets go, because we did for the last 40 years or so. And we know what happens. You get enormous inequality. You get very large numbers of people who don't have schools, who are, working 3 jobs, don't have health care, basic fundamental things. Just look at the difference between the United States and Canada. You don't I had a colleague who was Canadian. She went back and, I teach at the new school. It's considered a great job. And, but she left. She said, in Canada, I'm going to have my health care and my schooling paid for. I'm set. I don't have to worry.
And healthcare and education are 2 factors where it really stands out in the US that they're not accessible to everyone.
No, it's terrible. I mean, that's the basic cause. But then we have to understand the psychology and how that translates into, why you have someone like Trump and so forth. But going back to your point, I think you could also tease out, to use your word, on the left, because I would consider, Bernie Sanders a representative of the American left.
Sure.
But so-called woke culture, is that the left? I don't know.
Could you call it a distortion or an extreme of the left?
Yeah, it's a distortion or extreme, in the same way that on the right you have a distortion of conservatism. Trump is not a conservative. He's a radical rightist of some sort, but he's not a conservative. Conservatism, as you just said, says we have useful things in the past and so forth. Well, that's not what the Trump movement stands for.
Yeah. What does the Trump movement stand for, do you think?
Well, he just gave a speech. He said, I'm your warrior. I stand for retribution. I'm going to get back at whoever has hurt you, insulted you, mistreated you. And that's, you have somewhat related mentality on the so-called left.
Yes, the revenge politics.
Yes, the revenge, the politics of trauma.
And I guess what psychoanalysis can say is the psychological origin of your action is important. Meaning, if your actions are motivated consciously or unconsciously by revenge, say, as an example, that can taint it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it translates into, I think the loss of psychoanalysis in our culture in America and Europe in the last, 50 years or so has had enormous consequences, because when you had a strong kind of psychoanalytic presence in the culture, it did encourage you to think about motivation and where things were coming from within you and so forth. And we've lost that, so that people just think like, if I feel it, it's real. Well, no, it's not.
And that's the essence of the woke movement, is your subjective emotional truth is reality for all intents and purposes.
That is the essence.
Do you see, you teach at the New School?
Yes.
Do you see much of the manifestations of the woke movement in young people now?
Well, we have an undergraduate college, and I'm so old, and get to a certain point that people don't mess with you, so they know where I'm coming from, and they are very happy to take whatever I have to offer without pulling their tricks on me. But of course I see a lot of the manifestations, but it's not a problem for me.
Yeah. Well, what are the manifestations in terms of maybe how people think, or how does it affect, for example, people's willingness to debate in university?
No,
diversity of thoughts?
Not at the New School. Not at the New School. I have to say, even though, because the New School has a history of being on the left, and that means it was founded by anti-war activists. Then you get the immigration from Nazi Germany, you get the German intellectuals, then you get the women's movement and the New Left, you have anti-racism. So there's a real sense there of, critical thinking and of capitalism. And we have kind of students from all over the world, especially the graduate students. So I don't really think that, I think it's very protected from things that I think are much stronger at some other schools.
And I guess one of the things you learn from studying history is it's hard to study things as they're still happening and emerging, and there's a lot that you can get in retrospect.
That is one of the things that is great about history, is the taking a long view. That's another thing. Besides psychoanalysis that has been destroyed, is historical thinking. And in my own profession of history, I looked at the catalog for the American Historical Association, and they didn't have any sessions on ancient history and medieval history. Everything was centered on the present.
Yes.
And, that's terrible.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was, I'm not sure if you're aware of a British documentary called Century of Self.
Everybody tells me. In fact, I have it. I never saw it. I've heard
really
of it.
good.
Yeah, I know. I think it's very similar to my book, Secrets of the Soul.
I think so.
That sort of relates the growth of psychoanalysis to the spread of consumer capitalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
It mentions specifically Sigmund Freud's nephew by marriage, Edward
Yeah.
Bernays, who's
Yeah.
the founder of basically modern public relations
Yes.
and the way that you can use psychology in advertising.
Yeah.
And is he someone that you've encountered in your own studies?
Well, yeah, no, I write about him in Secrets of the Soul, and you know, it's kind of a great story about how he introduces these kind of quasi-Freudian ideas into advertising and so forth. Yeah, you know, Freud thought of emigrating to the United States way back in the 1880s or so, and if you see the pictures of his office in Vienna, and I don't know if it was recreated in the Freud Library in London, he had the Declaration of Independence framed above his desk and so forth. So he didn't only have negative feelings about. Yeah.
Do you think Freud's been sort of strawmanned and caricatured nowadays?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
What's
if you had to make a caricature of Freud, what's that caricature look like?
You know, it's the caricature of Freud. The most important thing is that he's authoritarian, dogmatic, doesn't really understand how science works, anti-woman, patriarchal, misogynistic, homophobic. What's interesting about the American reception to Freud is America fell completely in love with Freud in the 1920s, with the idea that he stood for free love, women's emancipation, gay liberation, sexual liberation, let it all hang out. So they fell in love with him, and then for this exactly the same reason, the opposite reason of this, meaning the same thing. No, he's against free love. He's against, he's against the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s, but he was in favor of the Cultural Revolution of the 1920s. From the point of view of Americans, all they really cared about was the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
So if they
it's like they were projecting whatever they wanted on Freud.
What they needed. I mean, he was. It was basically the women's movement of the 1970s. I mean, they were obsessed really with Freud as a symbol of patriarchy and so forth, and with the idea that feminism was a superior theory of psychology and of the mind than psychoanalysis. And of course, there have been, interesting and important. That's how I started, was with Juliet Mitchell and psychoanalysis and feminism.
So I guess Freud was quite apolitical in a sense.
He was a socialist. He was not apolitical. He was a socialist.
Or rather, maybe if I could amend that, he didn't want psychoanalytic thought to be co-opted for political purposes.
He was desperate to preserve psychoanalysis. He felt, and he was completely right, that the overall tendencies of modern culture, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of the rise of the masses and mass society and so forth. He felt that the overall tendency of modern culture was against psychoanalysis, against introspection.
Against
a complicated view of the mind. It was, and so forth. And that it would be very hard after he died to keep psychoanalysis alive. That was what he desperately wanted. So when Wilhelm Reich, for example, in the 1930s, wanted to use psychoanalysis to oppose Nazism, that drove him crazy, because he felt that it endangered psychoanalysis. In Austria, he felt, that they were protected by the Catholic Church, but, So, those were the things that concerned him. In terms of his personal politics, he started actually with abortion rights was one of the first things.
Oh, yeah.
And, free speech issues, marriage reform. And then he was a socialist because Vienna was so-called, in his lifetime, was called Red Vienna. It had a socialist government, and the government helped the psychoanalysts. They gave them a building. They supported them. They had public lectures for workers and that kind of thing. And it was a socialist culture, and everybody of that period, they were all socialist. Very good book about this is Elizabeth Danto's book, Freud's Free Clinics. About in the 1920s, and especially in terms of the left-wing culture of psychoanalysis, in terms of public clinics. Freud wrote several important articles about public, health insurance for the masses, why we had to support mental health spending and so forth.
Free speech is an interesting point because you can see for Freud on an individual level, free speech helps to uncover the darkness within us such that we can understand it, and on a collective level, free speech helps us to uncover the darkness in society, like prejudice, so that we can understand it and deal with it.
That's beautifully put. I think I couldn't improve on that. That's beautifully put. I agree.
And considering I'm jet lagged as well.
Yeah. Well.
So Professor Zaretsky, it's been lovely to talk to you. You're the first historian on the podcast. Hopefully not the last.
Right.
And it's been wonderful to speak to you. So thank you very much.
Good. Okay. Good.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love it if you share it with a friend, or you could give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee to support the team, and the links for that will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.